For many years, archaeologists puzzled over how a small city managed to conquer half the known world. At first, everyone thought the Romans simply had the deadliest weapons or the best armor. But here's where it gets interesting, because the truth turned out to be far more brutal and surprising. They won not because they fought harder, but because they simply refused to collapse from exhaustion. The Romans created a training system that today's physiologists would call inhumane and anatomically impossible. Imagine an army that treats a 30-kilometer march with a pack on their backs as a light warm-up. Most modern people wouldn't even be able to get out of bed the next morning after that. But these guys would start chopping down trees and building real wooden fortresses right after the march. And here's what's truly astonishing. They did this every day, year after year. Your office job requires a degree and years of experience, but you'd hardly survive a week there. Let's figure out exactly how Rome turned ordinary farmers into the terminators of the ancient world. Rome was constantly short of manpower because its enemies multiplied at an incredible rate. The Celts and the forest-dwelling Germanic tribes could easily field hundreds of thousands of warriors on the battlefield. These were huge, uncontrollable crowds of ferocious and extremely enraged people. The Roman Empire had nothing to counter such monstrous demographics. Therefore, the Romans realized something absolutely simple and vitally important. Each of their legionnaires had to be worth at least 5 barbarians on the battlefield. The armies of the ancient world did not spend much time training their soldiers. Commanders would simply hand a young peasant a long spear. They would point out the sharp end and curtly wish him luck in the brutal battle ahead. The Romans, however, categorically rejected such a primitive and irresponsible approach. They ruthlessly sent their men to a closed 4-month training camp. For most conscripts, this harsh place felt more like a real branch of hell. It was there that the solid foundation of that very legendary military endurance was laid. This foundation later shocked absolutely all of the empire's numerous enemies. Daily grueling training sessions always began with the first rays of the morning sun. And this was far from a light morning jog to stay in shape. Soldiers ran for hours across rough terrain in heavy gear. They didn't stop until their lungs began to burn. The harsh instructors had every legal right to punish any soldier who fell behind. These overseers in the army were officially called camp doctors. They mercilessly beat the weak with wooden sticks, literally nearly to death. These guys had no complaints to HR or breaks for smoothies. You either adapted very quickly to this completely insane physical strain, or you were sent in utter disgrace to do dirty work in the labor battalions. But the craziest and hardest test for the new recruits began a little later. It happened when the legionnaires were finally issued their first training weapons. These bulky wooden swords and woven shields were incredibly heavy. They weighed exactly twice as much as real, deadly combat gear. Why force living people to swing such a huge, unwieldy club? After all, your arms and shoulders start to ache so badly they feel like they're about to fall off after just 10 minutes. Because modern sports science calls this ingenious method the principle of progressive muscle overload. The Romans successfully practiced this approach 2,000 years before the advent of fitness centers. The instructors realized that one could artificially get used to unbearable weight. And then, in a real battle, a real steel sword would seem like a feather to the fighter. Every day, a recruit had to strike a wooden post 1,000 times. This thick post was deeply and securely dug into the damp ground of the training camp. My shoulders start aching unbearably just from the thought of this monotonous torture. If you try hitting a regular punching bag even 100 times in a row, the next morning you simply won't be physically able to lift your arm. But they delivered 1,000 powerful strikes with a very heavy stick every single day, and they had absolutely no chance to take a day off or a break. As a result, their steel-like muscles became completely accustomed to such an extreme workload. They adapted so that they could work effectively for hours without the slightest pause. The experienced, gray-haired veterans of the Legion knew how to notice the slightest details of behavior and formation. They could unerringly spot an unseasoned rookie on the battlefield in just a couple of seconds. For a fresh, green recruit, the hand holding the sword would begin to tremble treacherously quite quickly. This usually happened after just 20 minutes of intense, bloody combat. A true Roman soldier, however, could hold his shield and strike for an endless time. This seems completely illogical to the average modern person, but the grueling, exhausting training literally saved lives in the real-life bloody meat grinder. Rome's numerous enemies often fell into deep despair right in the middle of battle. They simply couldn't understand why these men in red tunics refused to tire or fall. The answer lies in the perfect muscle memory of a trained fighter. This memory was firmly ingrained in them through thousands of monotonous strikes against a training post. Modern cardiologists studying ancient texts have reached a striking conclusion about their health. It turned out that the legionnaires' resting heart rate slowed significantly. It dropped by about 20% after completing a grueling training regimen. This means that their cardiovascular system had adapted perfectly to immense stress. It functioned even better and more efficiently than that of many modern professional athletes. Blood was pumped more efficiently, delivering vital oxygen directly to the muscles. This process did not stop even under the most extreme physical exertion. The ancient soldier's body was literally completely restructured at a deep cellular level. This physiological transformation was vital for survival. Only in this way could the human body successfully endure this daily, sadistic nightmare. The Roman High Command constantly experimented with the duration of these training sessions. Generals tried to find the ideal mathematical balance between time spent and results. If young soldiers were trained for less than 4 months, real trouble ensued. They quickly broke down on their very first serious combat campaign far from home. If, on the other hand, they were trained for significantly longer, other economic problems arose. This turned into a senseless waste of vast state resources and provisions. 4 long months turned out to be that very ideal golden mean. This period was enough to transform yesterday's peasant into a perfect killing machine. Modern military generals still study this time frame closely. This system is taught in detail at the most prestigious military academies around the world. It's amazing how much can be achieved with just a wooden sword and a heavy pole. And of course, this requires a brutal camp instructor with a sturdy stick. But there's another detail here that makes this system absolutely unique. Training never stopped completely, even when the legion was in a safe place. In the winter, in their quiet quarters, the soldiers continued to practice maneuvers and build fortifications. This was done so that their muscles would not forget this specific strain. Ancient Rome categorically did not allow days off for its soldiers. Commanders were unyielding when it came to the combat readiness of their main military machine. They understood perfectly well that any complacency inevitably leads to weakness, and the slightest weakness on the empire's turbulent borders always meant certain death. In addition to swordsmanship, legionnaires were required to practice swimming regularly. Moreover, they had to do so fully equipped in heavy combat gear. This sounds like a sophisticated form of mass suicide, but there was a compelling reason for it. During frequent crossings of Europe's fast-flowing rivers, a colossal number of soldiers drowned. The water claimed more lives than were lost in other minor border skirmishes. When a man tries to swim with 30 kilograms of iron, a miracle occurs. Their lungs are forced to expand instantly to their absolute physiological maximum. This greatly increased lung capacity helped them immensely much later on. It gave them a huge advantage in protracted hand-to-hand combat on solid ground. As a result, the cunning Romans reaped a fantastic double benefit for their army. They derived it from just one deadly exercise in the water. And finally, the very last stage of this hellish program was hand-to-hand combat. It was an absolutely mandatory and utterly ruthless clash between two warriors. But this was no modern sport with soft mats on the floor. There was no referee to stop the match after the first successful throw. Roman wrestling continued until one of the opponents fell. The loser had to be reduced to a state where he was physically unable to rise from the ground. Sometimes 2 exhausted soldiers would roll around in the road dust for half an hour straight. They breathed heavily, burning away the last pitiful remnants of their physical strength. Each such clash tempered the spirit of the young fighter in preparation for real war. This brutal, prolonged struggle tested the very core of the future warrior's character. No one wanted to look weak in the eyes of their harsh comrades in arms. Commanders watched the duel closely, assessing the inner core of each recruit. The goal was not to become stronger, but to learn never to give up. After finishing boot camp, The soldiers faced the Roman army's greatest nightmare. The empire's territory stretched thousands of miles in every direction. Air transport or trains simply didn't exist in those harsh times. This meant that legionnaires had to march on foot for months to reach any battlefield. Imagine you and your girlfriend are planning a vacation and choosing a flight between Sri Lanka and the Philippines. Now imagine you have to walk there from Europe, carrying heavy luggage. It was precisely these enormous distances that these men faced every season. They marched endlessly along dusty ancient roads toward the uncertainties of war. A Roman march was never anything like a cheerful nature hike with songs around a campfire. During training, recruits were required to march 30 kilometers 3 times a week. Each of them carried about 40 kilograms of mandatory military gear. This weight included heavy armor, weapons, leather tents, and brass mess kits. Modern elite special forces also carry similar weights during their qualification marches. The only difference lies in the comfortable gear and technology available to modern fighters. Today's special forces have special anatomical boots with good soles, but ordinary Roman soldiers had only rough, open-toed leather sandals. Walking in such sandals over hard stones or sticky autumn mud was a real ordeal. It was a peculiar, incomparable, and dubious pleasure for the feet. But it was precisely these brutal and regular stresses that transformed the legionnaires' bodies forever. They forced the human body to undergo absolutely fantastic physiological metamorphoses. Due to constant overexertion, additional capillary networks began to grow rapidly in the leg muscles. The more blood capillaries appeared in the tissues, the better the blood supply became. More life-giving oxygen flowed uninterrupted to the tired muscles during movement. As a result, the soldiers' legs turned into true, tireless steel pistons. These well-trained legs simply refused to feel the usual pain and human fatigue. Enemies literally could not believe their own eyes right on the battlefield. They watched in horror as these monolithic columns, clad in iron, moved with astonishing speed. There were historical instances when legions had to undertake so-called forced marches. This was the fastest possible pace of movement under conditions of extreme military necessity. At such times, they covered up to 50 kilometers a day without slowing their pace even in the dead of night. Once the loyal troops of Gaius Julius Caesar accomplished a true logistical feat. They covered more than 160 kilometers in just under 3 days. The goal of this insane tactical dash was to take the Gauls by surprise. Moreover, they did not march there to rest and set up camp. They arrived at their destination and immediately, without the slightest pause, engaged in battle. That day, they bloodily annihilated a massive army of an unprepared enemy. Here it is worth pausing to fully grasp the scale of this historical madness. Getting modern people out of their cozy comfort zone is practically impossible today. Making them simply walk 50 kilometers seems like an utterly unrealistic task. But ancient legionnaires did this regularly in all kinds of bad weather. They carried heavy construction tools and a supply of dry rations. Add to that the massive battle shields, which pulled their arms down heavily. Your back starts to creak treacherously just from reading this list of travel gear. The Romans treated their own bodies as fail-safe military machines. This living machine had to be constantly warmed up to maximum speed before battle. In their harsh view, sweat had immense tactical value. Sweat shed during an exhausting march was guaranteed to save buckets of soldiers' blood. That precious blood would otherwise have been spilled in actual, brutal combat. Of course, far from all conscripts could withstand such a frantic pace of marching. Various joint injuries and strains were absolutely commonplace among soldiers. But the Roman military medical service operated flawlessly and with great coordination. It was surprisingly advanced for that harsh and dark historical era. Military doctors skillfully treated inflamed ligaments with special ointments and deep massage. The main goal of ancient physicians was to get every soldier back into action as quickly as possible. Roman commanders fully understood the value of trained and experienced personnel. Losing a veteran legionary simply because his feet were raw and bleeding was considered foolish. It was an unacceptable and extremely wasteful luxury for an empire constantly at war. That is why the condition of the soldiers' feet was monitored incredibly carefully every single night. The proper and tight lacing of leather sandals was strictly checked by commanders. Feet were cared for even more meticulously than the shine and cleanliness of personal weapons. The famous roads along which the legions marched ceaselessly did not appear on their own either. They did not spring up out of nowhere at the wave of a magic wand in the emperor's hands. The Roman legions were both a formidable army and great engineers. They functioned as the largest construction corporation in human history. If there was no proper road along their long journey, the problem was solved simply. The army would stop for a few days and diligently build the necessary route with their own hands. Moreover, they built these stone transportation arteries to last for centuries to come. They did it so well that many sections have easily survived to this day. Some of these ancient routes are still actively used in modern Europe. And here's what's truly interesting when comparing their methods to our architecture. Today, large-scale engineering projects are often hindered by strict safety regulations and environmental standards. Delays these days are not at all due to a lack of engineering expertise compared to the Romans. The Romans didn't have to spend months getting approval from officials to clear the forest. They didn't have to argue with environmentalists or advocates for rare forest bird populations. They simply saw a strategic goal before them and picked up their heavy iron axes. Thousands of hands worked in unison to cut a perfectly straight path through the densest Germanic forests. This incredible speed of troop movement completely disrupted the enemy's entire logistics. The Romans easily shattered the defensive plans of their numerous enemies across the entire map. The overconfident barbarians usually thought they had weeks to spare. They hoped to calmly prepare to defend their fortified forest settlements. But the brilliant Roman cohorts appeared on their horizon after just 3 short days. They arrived fully prepared for a bloody and merciless siege of enemy cities. Speed of movement had always been their most crucial and deadly tactical advantage. It more than compensated for the perpetual shortage of manpower on enemy territory. An army that moves twice as fast as the enemy holds the full initiative. It can strike suddenly at the weakest and most unprotected points of the enemy's defenses. Commanders use this logistical advantage constantly and with great ruthlessness. They forced the rank-and-file soldiers to squeeze every last drop of sweat from themselves for the sake of victory. Complaining about fatigue was pointless because the centurion walked alongside them, carrying the same weight. But reaching the battlefield was only half the battle. After all, one still had to survive there. Those iron legs and arms needed fuel to avoid breaking down halfway to the next war. Without proper and abundant nutrition, legionnaires could simply lose their strength during marches. And the basic diet of a Roman soldier might surprise many people today, especially those accustomed to proper modern sports diets and calorie counting. Every legionnaire consistently received about 1.5 kilograms of ordinary dry grain daily. This was the main and most important dish on the menu of the tireless conquerors of the world. This impressive daily portion provided them with about 3,000 net calories. Moreover, these were reserves of exclusively beneficial complex and very slow-release carbohydrates. No sweet protein bars, creatine, or trendy vitamin complexes existed back then. There was absolutely no room for fancy dietary supplements in their Spartan ancient diet. It was dominated solely by good old wheat, grown in the fields of a vast empire. It was this very wheat that became the solid foundation of their incredible and truly daunting endurance. The funniest thing about this military logistics was the process of preparing the issued rations. Legionnaires were never given wheat flour in a ready-made, conveniently packaged form. Soldiers couldn't just grab a bag of flour like shoppers in a cozy supermarket. After a grueling 30-kilometer march through the mountains, the soldiers would pull out heavy hand-cranked millstones. They would sit on the damp ground and begin the long, monotonous task of grinding the hard grain themselves. Congratulations! You've just completed another strength training session for your arms without even realizing it. From this freshly ground coarse flour, the soldiers prepared their simple field rations. They baked dense, unleavened flatbreads over the coals of a campfire or on hot, flat stones. Sometimes they cooked very thick and hearty porridge right in their copper mess tins. This evening culinary ritual was absolutely mandatory for the entire personnel. No one could shirk it or refuse to participate, citing extreme fatigue. A hungry soldier was always considered a potential threat to the overall combat effectiveness of the entire unit. But the attitude toward meat in the regular Roman army shatters all our modern stereotypes. We are used to thinking of brutal warriors as people who constantly devour mountains of meat. But eating large amounts of heavy meat-based food before a long march was considered a mistake. Commanders viewed this almost as a form of voluntary physical punishment. Experienced centurions very quickly noticed a strange pattern in their subordinates' behavior. They observed that soldiers on a heavy meat diet began to gasp for breath when walking at a brisk pace. These avid lovers of fresh meat quickly lost their breath and began to fall shamefully behind. Modern sports science fully confirms this ancient observation by Roman officers. Heavy animal proteins take too long to digest and require enormous amounts of energy. The stomach literally diverts the flow of fresh blood away from the working leg muscles. The Romans, however, preferred that all available energy be directed exclusively toward the work of the legs. The digestive tract was not to interfere with the grand plans of the great and invincible empire. As a result, the fearsome, armor-clad legionnaires became committed vegetarians by necessity. They abstained from meat on the march for the sake of their own combat effectiveness and sheer survival. Of course, the diet changed noticeably if the legion remained in a fortified winter camp for a long time. In a peaceful setting, the soldiers could quite easily treat themselves to game they had hunted. They took great pleasure in cooking thick and very aromatic meat stews on the march. They boldly added everything edible they could find in the forests or take from the peasants. Interestingly, these rugged warriors never wasted precious time on elaborate culinary processes. They paid no attention whatsoever to the visual presentation of their meals in the field. The cooks on duty would take large chunks of rock salt or coarse Himalayan salt to enhance the flavor. They would toss the entire chunk of salt directly into the boiling cauldron, barely bothering to grind it. In the harsh realities of war, only high-calorie content and speed of preparation mattered. No restaurant-style aesthetics held the slightest significance in the face of an impending battle. He quickly ate his huge portion of the scalding stew from the cauldron, and dinner was over. After that, the well-fed soldier had to immediately head out on night watch to guard the perimeter. Modern marathoners and professional triathletes also change their diets before races. They purposefully load up on the right complex carbohydrates to the brim. Sports doctors, looking all smart, call this complex biochemical process by the fancy term carb loading. It turns out that carbohydrates release energy slowly and steadily, without causing spikes in blood sugar. Roman military quartermasters discovered this crucial secret of endurance through trial and error. This happened a couple of thousand years before scientists invented the first microscopes. Officers simply watched closely to see exactly who fainted from hunger during a grueling march. Based on these brutal observations, they drew very precise logistical conclusions for supply. The Roman logistical machine ran like clockwork, delivering thousands of tons of grain. Specialized personnel handled fodder procurement long before the legion set out. The Romans drank a very specific mass beverage called pasca at every halt. This strange field cocktail was a mixture of plain water and sour wine. Essentially, it was ordinary water generously diluted with very sharp, cheap vinegar. The main purpose of this mixture was to effectively kill invisible microbes in the dirty liquid. This description sounds incredibly disgusting to any modern, pampered person. It's like being offered Greek salad dressing to quench your thirst. But the strong tartaric acid brilliantly and absolutely mercilessly destroyed dangerous bacteria. It excellently purified dirty, stagnant water from random forest swamps and dubious puddles. In addition, this sour and invigorating drink perfectly replenished the balance of important electrolytes. Soldiers lost these in vast quantities along with sweat under the scorching sun. It was the perfect ancient equivalent of modern energy drinks for athletes. The only difference was that this ancient recipe was completely free of harmful dyes and added sugar. It is important to note that the Roman army did not have huge, centralized field kitchens. There were no conventional supply wagons serving hot meals to the entire legion at once. Soldiers were efficiently divided into small, autonomous combat units of exactly 8 men. These compact units were historically called contubernia, and the soldiers lived together in a single tent. They pooled their rations and took turns cooking meals for the entire group. This decentralized system ingeniously solved the problem of potential food poisoning on the march. Cooking together after an exhausting day served as a powerful psychological bond. These 8 weary men gathered around the campfire gradually became a true frontline family. In brutal close-quarters combat, you weren't defending some abstract emperor in distant sunny Rome. You were covering the back of an ordinary guy with whom you had shared your last piece of dry bread just yesterday. This microsocial structure made the Roman infantry formation monolithic and impervious to panic. Time and again, enemies broke their spears against this invisible wall of sincere brotherhood. Interestingly, the most severe punishment was reserved for the despicable theft of food from a comrade. The guilty traitor could easily be stoned to death by his own comrades without trial. Food was considered an absolutely sacred resource on which the survival of the entire unit depended. They understood that an army marches on its stomach long before Napoleon's famous phrase. Their soldiers' stomachs were trained to digest nails just as well as their hands were trained to kill. A well-fed soldier is ready to go further, to carry out yet another crazy task every night. After a full day of marching, most normal armies of antiquity would simply drop their shields and fall asleep. The barbarians would build large bonfires and roast pieces of fresh meat. After a hearty dinner, they would fall asleep in a heap right on the bare, damp ground. The Romans, however, had completely different, strict instructions on this matter. Regardless of how tired they were, the soldiers would pull out their iron shovels and begin a massive construction project. Every night, they erected a fully fortified camp with high earthen ramparts. A deep moat was always dug in front of the rampart to stop a surprise attack. Sharp wooden stakes were driven into the top of the embankment to create a solid wall. This work was carried out every single evening without a single exception, and this happened even if they were set to leave for good the next morning. It sounds like a mockery of common sense, doesn't it? Imagine coming home after a grueling 12-hour work shift. Instead of resting, you grab a shovel and start digging a deep trench around your house, and then you diligently drive sharp stakes into your new fence. And all of this is done just so you can leave early in the morning for another city. Then, at the new location, this absurd cycle would repeat itself all over again. Setting up camp every day burned about 800 extra precious calories for each legionnaire. It was a colossal expenditure of energy after a 30-kilometer march carrying heavy loads. The entire process took up to 3 hours of continuous, monotonous physical labor. They could have spent that time with great pleasure on a long-awaited, sweet sleep. But Roman commanders always viewed the situation from a much broader perspective than their subordinates. The commanders understood what all their savage enemies categorically refused to understand. This grueling construction work was by no means a senseless punishment for the exhausted soldiers. In fact, it was a brilliant tactical ploy for training ideal warriors. Performing hard labor against a backdrop of extreme fatigue maximized their overall performance capacity. Modern sports coaches call this the development of the body's basic endurance to extreme levels. The legionnaire's body gradually grew accustomed to constant stress and immense physical strain. The body learned to tap into hidden reserves of strength even in the most critical moments. Soldiers continued to work with their shovels even when it seemed they had absolutely no energy left. Over time, the legionnaires could dig these endless trenches practically on autopilot. They carried out the earthwork with their eyes literally half closed from exhaustion. And this nighttime construction frenzy had one critically important psychological effect. Rome's numerous enemies very quickly learned one simple and terrifying lesson. They realized that attacking a Roman military camp at night was certain suicide. Any attempt to climb over the stakes and cross the deep moat in the dark ended in disaster. It always resulted in a massive bloodbath for the attacking side. As a result, barbarian armies often could not sleep a wink all night long. They sat in the cold, dark forest, waiting in terror for a sudden Roman attack. The nervous tension drained their strength long before the actual battle began. Meanwhile, Roman soldiers were inside their impregnable wooden fortresses. They slept peacefully and soundly, completely safe under the guard of sentries. A good deep sleep gave them an incredible advantage in the upcoming morning battle. A well-rested fighter with a clear head always has the upper hand over a tired enemy. He can easily kill a sleepy, nervous opponent with bloodshot eyes from lack of sleep. It turns out that a couple of hours of evening work with a shovel guaranteed them the saving of their lives. The Romans generously invested their sweat into wooden stakes to reap the best dividends. This priceless dividend was always a peaceful night's rest before the bloody carnage. It was pure, pragmatic war math, stripped of all unnecessary embellishments. It was completely devoid of any chivalric romance or foolish displays. In this harsh mathematics, the shovel proved to be just as deadly a weapon as a sharpened gladius. The construction of fortifications was thought out down to the smallest detail. The entire process was standardized across the vast territory of the expanding empire. Every soldier in the cohort knew his role precisely from the very beginning of his service. One legionary chopped wood, another dug the ground, and a third set up leather tents. The camp always had a strict rectangular shape and straight, intersecting streets. Safe locations for the large tents of the High Command were also clearly defined. If a legionnaire from Coal Britain happened to end up in a camp in hot Egypt, there were no problems. He could quickly find the medic's tent or the smithy in the dark with his eyes closed. Such total standardization saved an incredible amount of precious time every evening. Commanders did not need to give long explanations or draw up new plans at every location. In the center of the camp was always the praetorium for the commanding general. The main streets of the camp radiated out from the headquarters tent in perfectly straight lines. They were wide enough for the troops to march out in battle formation very quickly. This strict geometry allowed the entire legion to be roused by a nighttime alarm instantly. Soldiers marched out through the fortified gates in orderly ranks within minutes of the signal. Instead of sleepy men, the barbarians were met in panic by an organized, solid wall of shields. This sight demoralized the enemy far more than any loud shouts. It was more terrifying than even the most fearsome war paint on the faces of the savage barbarians. Strict order always triumphs over any disorganized chaos in warfare. This is especially true when that order is securely protected by a sturdy 3-meter-high wooden fence. Furthermore, a fortified camp served as an ideal base for prolonged sieges. The Romans could sit there for months methodically constructing heavy siege engines. They created a tight ring of blockade around the enemy and defended it with their fortifications. Those under siege looked down from the walls at this engineering nightmare and lost all hope. Rome's patience always outlasted the food supplies in the granaries of any besieged city, and then they would pack up their tents, burn their architectural masterpiece, and set off once more on an endless march. When it finally came down to the battle itself, the ancient world usually descended into a chaotic melee. Both opposing armies simply charged toward each other, letting out loud, animal-like screams. They would clash heads violently and in blind fury hack at everything around them. Whoever ran out of steam first and dropped their weapon in panic usually lost. It was more like a brutal sporting contest with no rules whatsoever. The educated Roman generals closely observed this barbaric approach to war. They quickly decided that it was too unpredictable, unreliable, and frankly foolish. They desperately needed a completely different, maximally reliable combat system. This system had to guarantee victory even on the most unfortunate and difficult day. And they introduced something on the battlefield that permanently shattered their enemies' morale. The Romans devised a unique system of constant rotation of soldiers on the front line. It was very similar to the modern quick substitutions of players in hockey or basketball. When lining up their troops before battle, they deliberately left empty corridors between units. These small gaps in the dense formation were not a random mistake by a drunken centurion. It was truly the ingenious foundation of their famous maniple, and later, cohort tactics. Thanks to these life-saving corridors, real magic happened every 15 minutes. Completely fresh and full of strength, soldiers would step onto the front lines of the bloody carnage. Meanwhile, the exhausted fighters, dripping with hot sweat, would calmly retreat far to the rear. There they could catch their breath, wipe their eyes, and take a life-saving sip of water. It sounds incredibly simple on paper, but in practice it required iron discipline. Try pulling off such a maneuver flawlessly under a dense hail of flying arrows and heavy spears. To Rome's many enemies, this looked like a sophisticated mockery of the rules of fair warfare. It felt like outright cheating on the highest difficulty level of survival. Imagine playing a long, grueling match in Dota 2 with no room for error. Meanwhile, your virtual opponent has absolutely no cooldowns on their powerful abilities. You're spending your last ounce of strength, and your character's health is already on its last legs. And then your real opponent simply transforms into a completely fresh and healthy fighter. You've been swinging a heavy sword for half an hour, and your arms are cramping with lactic acid. And suddenly a lively guy stands before you with a mocking smile on his face. It was precisely this terrifying feeling of absolute despair that the attacking Gauls constantly experienced. Time and again, they ran into this endless and merciless conveyor belt of Roman heavy infantry. Barbarian cultures, especially the Celtic tribes, had their own clear concepts of honor. Above all else in life, they valued personal physical valor and conspicuous heroism in battle. In their primitive understanding, a true warrior was supposed to fight fiercely to the death. He was obligated to remain standing until he fell into a pool of his own blood. When the barbarians saw Romans suddenly retreat after a brief skirmish, they rejoiced. They sincerely celebrated their quick victory over yet another legionnaire. They thought this cowardly fellow in a red cloak had simply been frightened by their battle cry. Imagine their genuine surprise just a few short seconds later. Another soldier, even more vicious and powerful, immediately and confidently took his place. All the barbarians' pride was shattered against the cold and cynical calculation of the legions. This war machine was completely devoid of any selfishness or desire for personal glory. One famous Germanic chieftain complained bitterly about this after his defeat. He said that fighting Rome was like trying to cut through an ocean wave with a sword. One solid wave of large shields was absolutely always followed by another. This monotonous process of mutual destruction did not cease until sunset. An ordinary legionary might go to the front lines of the slaughter 6 or 7 times per battle. He faithfully worked through his short but extremely intense and bloody shift. The legionnaire delivered precise, deadly blows like a flawless piston in an iron engine. And then he calmly retreated to drink his foul water mixed with sour vinegar. Meanwhile, his fresh comrade was doing the same brutal work on the front lines. For such an incredibly complex choreography of death to run without a hitch, a great deal was required. It took more than just superb physical fitness and endurance from each fighter. It required absolute and blind trust in the man standing to the right and left in the formation. If anyone panicked and broke the line during the retreat, an irreparable catastrophe would ensue. An enraged mob of enemies would immediately rush through the resulting breach. It was precisely in moments like these that the long months of eating porridge together by the campfire paid off in full. You entrusted your own unprotected back entirely to your comrade in arms. You knew for certain that he would just as reliably cover your back at the most critical moment. Strict discipline transformed a crowd of individuals into a single, invincible living organism. And let's not forget their boring but incredibly effective standard-issue weapon. This instrument of regular victory was the famous short, double-edged gladius sword. The Romans never swung it high above their heads in the heat of heavy battle. They didn't try to chop off an enemy's arm or head with a beautiful, dramatic wide swing. They thrust from behind their massive tall shields with very sparing and economical movements. A straight thrust requires several times less precious energy than a chopping blow. At the same time, it kills the enemy much more reliably and quickly right on the spot. It was enough to pierce the enemy just 5 centimeters deep into the soft abdomen. After such a precise, surgical thrust, any battle for the barbarian ended instantly. While the barbarian leaped, shouted loudly, and wasted energy on intimidation, the Roman remained silent. He stood firmly, sheltered behind his shield, absorbing blows and coolly waited for the right moment. A short thrust with the gladius, and the next enemy falls to the ground, choking on his own blood. This was not a beautiful, heroic war from fairy tales, but an industrial meat processing operation. It functioned thanks to perfect human resource management right in the heat of battle. This is both terrifying and awe-inspiring, forcing us to rethink the limits of human physical capabilities. When we look at the ruins of the Colosseum or the remains of ancient aqueducts, we often forget who exactly defended them. These monumental structures could not have existed without the bloody foundation laid by tireless legions. The Roman war machine was not magical. It contained no secret alien technologies. All their magic lay in superhuman discipline, endless training, and the ability to endure endless pain. They understood human physiology millennia before we invented fitness trackers and smartwatches. And this knowledge allowed them to create soldiers who were feared more than the wrath of the ancient gods themselves. Today we live in a world of comfort, where the toughest challenge is an internet outage lasting a couple of hours. We order food with a single click and complain of fatigue after sitting for a long time in a comfortable office chair. But the history of the Roman legions reminds us of what the human body and spirit are truly capable of. They weren't superhumans. They were simply farmers whom the system forced to go beyond the limits of what was possible. Their legacy is not only roads and laws, but also proof that endurance always trumps talent.